I had been a freelance estate appraiser for 11 years when the email from Prude and Combs landed in my inbox on a Tuesday morning in the middle of March, and I nearly deleted the whole thing as spam without reading past the subject line. The subject line read, "Estate Inventory Opportunity, Weathersby Property," and the message asked whether I was available for a 3-week residency job cataloging the full contents of a farmhouse outside a town called Victory. I had never heard of Victory before that morning, and when I looked it up, I found barely 60 residents spread across unincorporated land in the Northeast Kingdom, closer to New Hampshire than to anywhere I had ever worked before. My son Sam was 9 years old that spring, and the mortgage on our small house in Burlington was 11 weeks behind because his father had quietly stopped sending support payments the previous autumn. A 3-week contract paying $19,500 felt less like an ordinary job opportunity and more like a rope thrown down to someone who had already gone under the water once or twice that winter. Sam's father, a man named Curtis I had married far too young and divorced 2 years earlier after he lost a stable position at a lumber yard outside Bear, had promised faithfully to keep sending $800 a month in child support. He simply stopped answering my calls sometime around Thanksgiving that year, and my own appraisal work had slowed considerably that winter as well. The usual steady stream of estate clients drying up the way it always seemed to during the coldest months in Vermont. Families generally preferred settling inheritances in springtime instead, once the roads cleared and the funerals sat further behind them, and I had already sold my grandmother's wedding ring the previous December just to cover a car repair bill. I had also started picking up the phone less often whenever an unfamiliar number appeared on the screen, certain it would be the mortgage company again, asking about payments I could not currently make. So, when Denise's email arrived describing a job that would let me clear that entire debt in one single stroke, I understood perfectly well, even that very first morning, exactly how easily desperation could talk an otherwise cautious person into ignoring every warning sign standing directly in front of them. I called the number listed at the bottom that same afternoon and reached a paralegal named Denise, who explained that a woman named Margaret Weathersby had died back in February at the age of 94. She had left behind a farmhouse full of furniture and books and family belongings that had never been sorted in half a century, and the estate needed a full inventory before the property could go to auction. Denise mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the position required living on site for the full 3 weeks, since the house had no reliable cell service and the roads into Victory could turn bad without warning. I asked why they needed someone living there instead of just driving in each day, and she said the attorney handling the estate preferred it that way, since the work needed to be done carefully and without interruption. By the time I finally hung up the phone, I had already told her I would take the job, doing the math in my head the entire time about exactly how many months of overdue mortgage payments the fee would actually cover. I called my mortgage servicer that same afternoon, a company based out of Hartford I had grown to genuinely dread hearing from, and I explained to a representative named Patricia that I expected to bring my account current within the month, along with a lump sum payment covering the 11 weeks I currently owed. Patricia informed me, not unkindly, that the account stood $2,340 past due as of that particular morning in March. Continued non-payment beyond another 30 days, she explained, would trigger a formal notice from the bank's legal department regarding foreclosure proceedings on the house Sam and I had lived in since he was a baby. I thanked her, hung up, and sat at my kitchen table doing the math one more time, slower this time, until the number Denise had quoted me settled into something concrete. And it became, in my mind, the plain difference between keeping our home and losing it entirely within a matter of months. My sister Rachel drove up from Montpelier 2 days later to watch Sam, and when I told her about the offer over coffee, she gave me a long look I recognized from years before, the same one she gave me the day I told her I was marrying Sam's father. "It sounds like something straight out of a horror movie," she said, "a dead woman's old house sitting in the middle of nowhere with absolutely nobody around to check on you at all for 3 straight weeks." I told her the law firm had been operating out of the same Montpelier office since 1983, with a real address and a bar registration number I had checked myself against the state website that morning. She made me promise to call her every single night before dark and to text her the exact address before I left Burlington, which I did that same evening with a small, unfamiliar flutter of nerves settling somewhere low in my chest. The drive out to Victory took just under 3 hours, and the last 40 minutes ran through roads that grew narrower the farther east I went, past sugar maple stands and half-collapsed barns and one general store with a hand-painted sign reading Alderseas. The pavement gave out completely at some point without any warning sign at all, and I found myself driving on packed dirt through forest grown so dense the afternoon light barely reached the ground beneath it. Harold Pruitt met me at the house himself. A tall, stooped man somewhere in his 60s wearing a heavy wool coat despite the mild weather, and he shook my hand with a grip that felt strangely reluctant to let go. The house itself was larger than the photographs had shown, a federal-style farmhouse with a wide central chimney and additions built onto the back at different points across the last century and a half of its existence. Its paint had faded over the decades, from white to a dull gray, and it was peeling badly along the walls that faced north, away from what little afternoon sun the property actually received in a given day. Pruitt walked me through the ground floor quickly, gesturing at furniture and cabinets stuffed with china, explaining that Margaret Weathersby had lived alone since her husband disappeared back in 1971. She had apparently never once thrown away a single item in all the decades since his disappearance, which meant the inventory would likely run to several thousand individual pieces before I ever finished counting them. He mentioned the husband's disappearance so casually it took me a moment to register it, sandwiched between a comment about silver flatware and a warning that the upstairs water heater took nearly 10 minutes to run hot. He pointed out a locked gun cabinet in the study, one the estate paperwork listed separately for a licensed firearms dealer to eventually handle rather than myself. He also mentioned a small collection of Civil War-era coins in the good parlor, appraised years earlier, based on a prior valuation Margaret herself had commissioned in the 1990s, at somewhere around $4,000 total. When I finally worked up the nerve to ask what had actually happened to Edwin Weathersby, Pruitt said only that the man had gone walking along the Moose River one October evening and simply never come back home again. The county had searched the riverbanks for the better part of 2 weeks before officially listing him as presumed drowned, though his body had never once turned up in the water or anywhere along its length. He handed me a thick folder of paperwork that included the signed contract, a single typed page of house rules, and a laminated map showing the boundaries of the 52 acres that came attached to the property. The rules themselves were oddly specific for what should have been, on paper at least, a fairly simple and entirely unremarkable cataloging job lasting only 3 short weeks in total from start to finish. I was not permitted to remove any item from the house until the full inventory was approved. I was to avoid the locked room at the top of the back staircase entirely, and I was expected to send a written report each week despite the house having no internet connection anywhere I could find. Pruitt left just before 5, driving off down the dirt road in a black sedan that kicked up dust behind it, and I stood on the porch a long moment afterward listening to the engine fade into nothing. I became aware, all at once, of exactly how alone I actually was out there, with the nearest neighbor sitting 1.5 miles off according to the laminated map Pruitt had left folded in my hands that evening. I spent that first night doing very little, mostly unpacking into the ground floor guest room Pruitt had pointed out, eating a sandwich I had brought from home at the kitchen table under a single working overhead light. The house made the sounds old houses always make once the sun goes down, settling and creaking somewhere up in the rafters, and I told myself firmly and repeatedly that none of it meant anything at all. I had stayed in older buildings plenty of times before that job and knew the ordinary difference between the structure simply adjusting to the evening cold and something that should have actually worried me. I called Rachel around 8 and told her everything was fine, that the house was big and a little unsettling in the way empty houses always are, but that the job itself looked straightforward enough. Room after room of dishes and furniture and old photographs, nothing more sinister than tedium, or so I told myself as I climbed into an unfamiliar bed that first night and waited a long time for sleep to actually come. I woke early on my first full day at the house, made coffee on the ancient percolator I found in a cabinet above the stove, and started in the front parlor with a clipboard, a camera, and 3 legal pads full of blank inventory sheets. The parlor alone held close to 200 items once I started counting properly. Oil lamps and porcelain figurines and a glass-fronted cabinet stuffed with teacups that had clearly not been used or even touched in decades. Each piece needed a description, a photograph, and an estimated value, and by the middle of the afternoon I had covered barely a third of the room, which told me the 3-week timeline Pruitt had promised was already going to be tight. Around 4 in the afternoon, I noticed a heavy wingback chair sitting near the fireplace at an angle it had not been in that morning, turned slightly toward the window instead of facing the room the way it had when I first walked through with Pruitt the previous evening. I told myself I had simply misremembered its position, since I had been distracted the day before by everything else Pruitt was pointing out, and I moved on without giving it much more thought than that. The work itself, once I truly settled into the rhythm of it, turned out exactly as tedious and exacting as Denise had warned me it might be over the phone that first Tuesday back in March. A set of 8 ladder-back dining chairs alone took most of a morning to properly document, each one photographed from 4 angles and cross-referenced against auction records from comparable Vermont estates. I finally settled on an appraised value of roughly $800 for the full set once I accounted for a hairline crack running through one rear leg. The grandfather clock in the front hallway, still keeping reasonably accurate time despite its age, appraised out somewhere near $1,200 once I confirmed the maker's mark inside the case matched a workshop that had operated out of St. Johnsbury back in the 1860s. I found, tucked inside a hollowed-out family Bible on the parlor's top shelf, a small bundle of cash amounting to nearly $3,000 in worn 20s, which I photographed carefully and locked in my glove compartment until Pruitt could arrange its proper transfer to the estate. By the second day, I had worked my way into the dining room and the small library off the hallway, and the anomalies, if that was even the right word for them yet, kept accumulating in ways I could not quite dismiss anymore. A stack of photograph albums I had left squared on the library table one afternoon was found the next morning fanned out slightly, as though someone had flipped through them during the night while I slept 2 rooms away with the door shut. A tall oval mirror in the upstairs hallway hung draped with a bedsheet when I first arrived. Something I assumed was simply an old-fashioned mourning custom Margaret had never bothered to undo after her husband's disappearance decades earlier. I pulled the sheet down myself on my 3rd day there out of simple curiosity, and I found it covering the glass again the following morning, folded with a neatness I certainly had not used when I first removed it. I mentioned it to no one at all, because there was no one out there to mention it to, and because I could already imagine exactly how it would sound if I said it out loud to Rachel over the phone that evening. The house also had a habit of running cold in specific spots that made no obvious sense. A patch of hallway outside the downstairs bathroom that dropped noticeably in temperature no matter what time of day I passed through it. A corner of the library did something similar, where my breath sometimes fogged faintly in the air even with the old wood stove going strong and hot just a few feet away on the other side of the nearest wall. I chalked it up to old construction and poor insulation, the kind of thing you would expect from a farmhouse built long before anyone worried about drafts, and I kept working because the money mattered more to me than a few strange cold spots ever could. The locked room at the top of the back staircase bothered me more than I wanted to admit, mostly because Pruitt had been so specific about it without offering any real explanation for why it mattered. It sat behind a door with an old-fashioned skeleton key lock, no keyhole visible from my side except a small brass plate worn smooth from what must have been decades of use, and every time I passed it on my way to the 2nd-floor bedrooms, I found myself slowing down without meaning to. On the 4th night, I woke somewhere around 2 in the morning to what sounded like footsteps on the back staircase, slow and deliberate, moving upward toward that same locked door at a pace that felt almost unbearably patient. I lay still in bed for a long time, telling myself it was the house settling the way old houses always do, until the footsteps stopped directly outside my bedroom door and did not start again for nearly a full minute. When I finally worked up the nerve to open the door, the hallway was completely empty, though the air outside my room felt noticeably colder than it had any right to be given how warm the rest of the house remained that particular night. By the end of the first week, I had finished the parlor, the dining room, the library, and most of the kitchen, and I had started keeping a second notebook alongside the inventory sheets, one where I quietly recorded the things that did not belong on any official estate paperwork. There was the sound of a woman humming somewhere upstairs on the 5th night, faint and tuneless, cutting off the moment I stood at the bottom of the staircase and called out to ask if anyone was there. There was the framed photograph of Margaret Weathersby as a young bride that I found turned face down on her dresser 2 mornings in a row, despite my setting it upright myself both times before going to bed. And there was the persistent feeling Impossible to prove and embarrassing to even write down that I was being watched while I worked. A pressure at the back of my neck that made me turn around sharply more times than I wanted to admit to myself. My phone occasionally caught a single weak bar of signal if I stood near the kitchen window, and on Friday evening of that first week, I used it to search briefly for property records on the county website. I found a deed history that listed the Weathersby name attached to that parcel continuously since the 1840s without a single recorded sale in nearly 200 years. I decided on Saturday morning that I badly needed groceries and a proper break from that house, regardless of how far behind schedule that decision might end up putting me before the week was even through. I drove the 20 minutes into the nearest real town, a place called Concord that had an actual paved main street and a small grocery store attached rather conveniently to a hardware business next door. I stopped first at Aldersea's, the general store I had passed on my way into Victory that first afternoon, mostly because it was closer and because something about the hand-painted sign had stuck with me since I drove past it. The woman behind the counter introduced herself as Ruth Aldersea, somewhere in her 70s with sharp eyes and a way of studying me that made it clear she already knew exactly who I was and why I had come to town before I ever opened my mouth. "You're the one staying out at the old Weathersby place, isn't that right?" she said. Not really a question at all. So much as a statement she clearly wanted me to confirm for her own private satisfaction. When I told her I was doing the inventory for the estate before the auction, her expression shifted into something harder to read, somewhere between pity and a kind of grim resignation I did not fully understand yet. "Margaret was always a good woman," Ruth said carefully, choosing her words the way people tend to when they are quietly deciding exactly how much of the truth a total stranger actually deserves to hear. "But that house has never let anybody rest easy inside it, not since long before Margaret's own time there. And certainly not since Edwin walked off into those woods and never came back out of them again." I asked her what exactly she meant by all that, and she waved a hand in the air, as if brushing the whole question away entirely, seemingly unwilling to elaborate any further right there in her own crowded store. She told me instead that I should ask old Dale Corey over at the Historical Society in St. Johnsbury if I truly wanted the long version, since Ruth herself preferred not to discuss it at any length inside her own store. I drove the rest of the way into St. Johnsbury that same afternoon instead of heading straight back to the farmhouse, telling myself it counted as research relevant to the appraisal even though I knew perfectly well that was not my actual reason for going. The St. Johnsbury Athenaeum kept local records going back well over a century, and the woman at the front desk directed me to a retired local historian named Dale Corey, who spent most weekday afternoons there sorting through Old Town archives for a small stipend the Historical Society paid him. Dale was a heavy-set man in his 80s, with thick glasses and a slow, careful way of speaking. And when I mentioned the Weathersby property, he set down the folder he had been holding and looked at me for a long moment before saying anything at all. He asked first whether Pruitt's firm knew I had come to see him, and when I told him it did not, he seemed to relax slightly, as though that single fact told him something important about how seriously I was taking whatever I had already noticed out at the house. That house was built in 1841 by a man named Josiah Weathersby, he told me, a mill owner who made his fortune processing wool before the railroads changed everything for towns like Victory. Josiah's youngest daughter, a girl named Abigail, died of a fever in 1846 at only 7 years old, and according to old newspaper clippings Dale kept in a folder marked for the family. Josiah was never quite the same man again after that. Dale pulled out a second folder from the shelf behind him, thinner and considerably older looking than the first one had been, and told me that Josiah had grown obsessed with contacting his dead daughter in the years following her burial. He joined a spiritualist circle that met regularly over in St. Johnsbury on Thursday evenings, and before very long at all, he had begun hosting sittings of his very own back at the farmhouse in Victory. The spiritualist movement had swept across rural New England hard during those years, Dale explained, drawing in grieving parents and widowed spouses from towns all across the Northeast Kingdom. The circle Josiah belonged to reportedly counted nearly 20 regular members at its peak, before quietly dissolving sometime in the early 1860s for reasons the surviving records never fully explained. According to a diary excerpt Dale had transcribed decades earlier from a document since lost to a house fire at the Historical Society, Josiah believed he had actually succeeded sometime around 1849. He described, in his own careful handwritten words, a definite presence that answered questions posed to it during a sitting held in the good parlor on the ground floor of the old house. The entry Dale read aloud to me described knocking sounds and a child's voice repeating a nursery rhyme Abigail had loved, and it described Josiah weeping with joy at what he believed was proof his daughter had never truly left the house at all. But something changed after that sitting, Dale told me, his voice dropping lower as though the story itself made him uncomfortable even after all the decades he had spent studying it in careful detail. Josiah's remaining household grew steadily ill within the year that followed that first sitting, his wife dying slowly of a wasting sickness the local doctor could never properly diagnose or explain. Josiah himself wrote in a later diary entry that the house needed someone always present and always tending to it, or the presence living inside it grew restless and the whole family suffered badly for it. I asked Dale what he meant by someone always present, and he shrugged in a way that suggested he had wondered about the same question for years without ever landing on an answer he felt confident about. What he could tell me for certain, based on property records and town census documents going back generations, was that the Weathersby house had never once sat empty for more than a few weeks at a time since Josiah built it. It passed instead from relative to relative down through the long decades, and eventually to unrelated tenants whenever the family bloodline thinned out too much to keep providing a willing occupant. Dale had a list, handwritten on yellowing paper, naming at least 6 people connected to the house who had died on the property or vanished from it entirely somewhere between 1850 and the present day. It included a hired caretaker in 1922 who was found frozen in the orchard despite dying in the middle of July, and a boarder in 1958 who simply stopped writing letters home and was never seen again by anyone in Victory. Edwin Weathersby's name sat near the very bottom of that list, added by Dale himself sometime in the 1970s after the disappearance made the local paper for several consecutive weeks that autumn. Margaret's name was not on the list at all, since she had apparently died naturally enough in her own bed, according to the county coroner's official written report filed that year in St. Johnsbury. Dale mentioned, almost reluctantly, that Margaret had visited the Athenaeum herself several times over the decades, always asking after the very same records I was asking about now, as though she had spent much of her life trying to understand the same thing I had only just started. Before leaving St. Johnsbury that afternoon, I asked Dale for directions to the small family cemetery Josiah had supposedly buried Abigail in, and he drew me a rough map on the back of a photocopy, warning me the plot sat overgrown and mostly forgotten behind the tree line at the rear of the property. I found it easily enough once I got back to the farmhouse, a low iron fence enclosing perhaps a dozen weather headstones, most too worn by now to read clearly. Abigail's small marker near the center still showed her name in the years of her short life, carved in letters that had somehow stayed legible, despite 170 years of Vermont winters passing over them. Someone had left fresh flowers at the base of that particular headstone, white lilies not yet wilted, which struck me as strange given that Margaret had been dead for weeks and no one else, as far as I knew, had any reason to be tending graves out here at all. I stood there a long while in the fading afternoon light, reading Edwin's own memorial marker 2 rows back, a stone placed without any body beneath it at all. I found myself wondering, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, exactly who had been leaving flowers for a girl who died before the Civil War even started. I drove back to the farmhouse that evening with considerably more on my mind than I had carried with me that morning, turning Dale's stories over and over as the road narrowed and the trees closed in around the car in the deepening dusk. I told myself, as I had told myself so many times already that week, that old houses collected old stories the way attics collected dust, and that grief and superstition could explain almost everything Dale had described without requiring anything genuinely supernatural to actually be happening. Still, when I pulled into the driveway and saw the upstairs window of the locked room glowing faintly with what looked like lamplight, I felt my whole body go cold. Since the house had no working electricity above the ground floor circuit Pruitt had shown me that first evening. I sat in the car a long while after that, gathering myself in the dark before finally making myself get out of the car and go back inside that waiting house, my legs stiff and unwilling beneath me. Nothing waited for me inside when I finally crossed the threshold that night. No figure standing on the stairs, no voice calling out from the dark hallway above. Just the ordinary silence of an empty farmhouse settling around me the way it always did. I'd check the upstairs hallway anyway, standing at the bottom of the back staircase and staring up at the locked door for a long stretch of minutes, watching for any trace of light beneath it that might explain what I thought I had seen from the driveway earlier. There was nothing. No glow, no sound, nothing but the same worn brass plate and the same old-fashioned lock that had kept that room sealed since before I ever arrived at the property 3 days into that first strange week. I went to bed that night with the chair wedged under my bedroom doorknob for the first time since arriving, feeling foolish even as I did it, and I lay awake a long while listening to the house breathe around me in the dark before sleep finally pulled me under against my will. Monday morning brought a task I had been putting off since my first day on the property, walking the 52 acres with a camera to document the exterior structures and boundary lines for the estate records, including the small orchard Dale had mentioned during our first conversation at the Athenaeum. The orchard sat maybe a quarter mile behind the house, a dozen old apple trees gone wild with untrimmed branches. I worked my way through it slowly that morning, photographing the trees and the crumbling remains of an old equipment shed, while the late morning light filtered down green and dappled through the leaves overhead. I became aware, sometime after I had been out there perhaps 20 minutes, of a sound moving through the underbrush somewhere off to my left, keeping pace with me at a distance whenever I walked and going silent the instant I stopped to listen for it more carefully. I told myself it was a deer or one of the neighboring farm dogs Ruth had mentioned, though every farm dog she described avoided this land entirely. I kept walking anyway, faster now, my camera forgotten and hanging loose against my chest, as I made my way back toward the tree lines separating the orchard from the house. The sound behind me sped up when I did, branches snapping somewhere close enough that I could hear individual twigs breaking underfoot, and I broke into a full run the last 100 yards across the open field between the orchard and the back porch, not daring to look over my shoulder the entire way. I made it up the porch steps and through the back door, slamming it behind me and throwing the bolt with hands that would not stop shaking, and I stood pressed against the inside of the door for a long moment, listening, before I finally worked up the nerve to look out through the small window set into its upper panel. The field behind the house stood empty in the midday sun, nothing moving among the tall grass between the porch and the orchard. No animal, no person, nothing at all to explain the sound that had chased me the entire length of that open field only moments before. I did not go back out to finish photographing the orchard that week, marking the exterior structures as incomplete in my notes and telling myself, without much real conviction, that Pruitt could send someone else out to finish that particular section of the survey if it came down to it. The second week brought changes I could no longer explain away as simple tiredness, or an overactive imagination working overtime after too many strange stories from strangers in town that week. Items I had already cataloged and boxed began turning up back in their original locations around the house, over and over again, no matter how carefully or securely I had packed them away the night before. A set of silver candlesticks I had wrapped and placed in a moving box on Monday was found sitting upright on the mantel again by Wednesday morning, as though someone had carefully unwrapped them overnight while I slept. I started photographing everything the moment I finished cataloging it, time-stamping each image obsessively, partly for the estate records and partly, I admitted only to myself, as evidence I might eventually need for some future conversation about what was happening inside that house. The cold spots grew more frequent and less confined to specific corners, following me some days from room to room in a way that made the hair on my arms rise even when I told myself firmly it was only a draft finding new paths through old walls. And twice that week I heard the humming again, closer both times, once from directly behind the closed door of the room I was standing in, so close that I actually flinched and spun around expecting to find someone standing right there in the room with me. I drove into Concord again on Wednesday of that second week for more groceries, and I stopped at Alderseas on the way back through Victory, mostly because I did not want to face another silent evening in the farmhouse without talking to another living person first. Ruth studied my face carefully across the counter, the way she had the first time I walked into her store, and asked whether the house was treating me all right, phrasing it so plainly that I understood immediately. She already expected the answer to be no, regardless of what I actually told her. I admitted, carefully, that things had gotten stranger since our last conversation, and she nodded slowly, setting down the can of coffee she had been ringing up. She told me instead about a boarder named Colleen who had stayed at the farmhouse for a few months back in 1958, a woman Ruth's own mother had been friendly with, before Colleen simply stopped answering letters and was never heard from again by anyone in town. Ruth told me her mother always said the dogs on the neighboring farms would not cross onto Weathersby land, even when a rabbit ran straight over the property line ahead of them. Folks in Victory had long ago stopped asking too many questions about the house, out of a kind of practiced, inherited caution passed down the same way recipes or old grudges get passed down in small towns like theirs. She did not tell me to leave outright, but the way she pressed a small paper sack of extra crackers into my hands at the register, refusing payment for them, told me plainly enough what she actually thought I should do with the time I had left out there. Thursday of the second week was the day everything finally shifted from unsettling into something I could no longer file away under old houses and overactive nerves working against me late at night. I had moved up to the second-floor bedrooms by then, working through a room that had clearly belonged to a child once, decades earlier, judging by the small bed frame and the faded wallpaper printed with rabbits chasing each other endlessly around the walls. A rocking chair sat in the corner near the window, and around mid-afternoon, while I was crouched at the closet cataloging a stack of folded linens, I heard it begin moving behind me. The wood creaking in that particular rhythm only a rocking chair actually in motion can make. I turned around slowly, half expecting a draft or a settling floorboard to explain it away, the way everything else had been explained away so far. The chair kept rocking steadily for nearly 10 more seconds after I turned to look directly at it, slowing only gradually until it came to a complete and total stop entirely on its own. My hands were shaking by the time I made myself walk over and touch the seat, which felt distinctly cooler than the surrounding air in the room, cold enough that I pulled my fingers back almost immediately without meaning to. I left that room and did not go back into it again that day, retreating instead to the kitchen where I sat at the table for a long while, trying to steady my breathing and talk myself into a version of events that made sense. I called Rachel that evening and, against my better judgment, told her some of it, carefully editing out the parts I knew would make her drive out immediately to pull me off the property against my own wishes. She told me to come home, that no amount of money was worth what I was describing to her over a bad phone connection. I told her I would think about it, though we both already knew I had no real intention of walking away from $19,500 with only a handful of days completed toward the full 3 weeks. Sam got on the phone for a minute before bed, chattering happily about a school project on the water cycle due that upcoming Friday, his voice bright and completely untroubled. Hearing his small, ordinary voice against the strange quiet of that kitchen made something in my chest ache in a way I had not expected. A sudden sharp longing to simply drive home and hold on to something familiar instead of finishing a contract that had started to feel less like a job and more like a test I was not sure I would pass. That night I slept in the guest room downstairs again, with a chair wedged under the door, and sometime after midnight I woke to the unmistakable sound of the back staircase creaking under slow, deliberate weight, one step at a time, moving steadily upward toward the locked door, the way it had that first week. This time I did not stay lying in bed under the blankets, telling myself the sound would simply pass on its own the way it always seemed to eventually. I got up, took the flashlight from my bag, and walked out into the hallway toward the sound, telling myself firmly that whatever was happening in that house, hiding under blankets clearly, was not going to make it stop happening around me. The staircase was empty when I reached it, the flashlight beam sweeping across bare wooden steps that showed no sign of anyone having climbed them at all. The air near the top of the stairs hung noticeably colder than anywhere else in the house, though, cold enough that my breath fogged visibly in front of the flashlight beam. And then, from behind the locked door at the top of those stairs, I heard it clearly for the first time, not humming this time, but a child's voice, small and thin, singing a few words of a nursery rhyme I did not recognize before falling silent again as abruptly as it had started. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs for what felt like a very long time, unable to make myself climb any farther. Only once the cold finally broke and the ordinary temperature of the house reasserted itself around me did I turn and walk back to the guest room on legs that did not feel entirely steady beneath me. I did not manage to fall back asleep after that, and I lay in the dark, listening as, one by one, over the next hour, Every door on the ground floor began opening and closing on its own somewhere out beyond my bedroom. Softly at first, and then with increasing force, the pantry door, the cellar door, and the door to the good parlor each slammed in turn, as though something moved methodically through the house, checking each room for an occupant it could not locate. I stayed exactly where I was, the chair still wedged beneath my own door, gripping the flashlight in both hands and counting the slams until they finally stopped, somewhere close to 4 in the morning. The house settling back into an ordinary, exhausted silence that felt almost more unnerving than the noise had been. When the first gray light of dawn finally reached the window, I got up on legs that still did not feel entirely steady. I checked every door on the ground floor myself, finding each one closed properly, none damaged, none showing any sign at all of having moved throughout the entire long night I had just spent listening to them. By the time full daylight finally reached the kitchen windows, I had already given up on resting further. I spent most of that Friday morning sitting at the table with my phone in hand, seriously considering whether to simply pack my car and drive back to Burlington, regardless of the money I would forfeit by breaking the contract early. What kept me there in the end was not entirely the money, though the money mattered more than I wanted to admit, even to myself, sitting alone at that kitchen table that gray Friday morning. It was the growing, uncomfortable certainty that whatever was happening in that house was connected somehow to Margaret, to Edwin, and to the long list of names Dale had shown me at the Athenaeum. Walking away without understanding any of it would mean carrying the unanswered fear of it home with me, regardless of the distance I put between myself and victory. I called Harold Pruitt that afternoon and asked him directly, as calmly as I could manage, whether he could tell me anything more about the locked room upstairs, and about why it had specifically been excluded from the estate inventory in the first place. His answer came slower than I expected, with a pause on the line long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped entirely before he finally spoke again in a careful, measured voice. That room belonged to Margaret alone, he told me, and the family who retained his firm, distant cousins out in Ohio who had never once visited the property had specifically instructed that it remain sealed and untouched until after the estate sale concluded. When I pressed him further, asking what exactly was inside that room that required such particular handling, he told me only that Margaret herself had left written instructions decades earlier regarding that specific space. His firm was legally bound to honor those instructions regardless of how unusual they might seem to any outside observer. I asked whether those instructions said anything about strange sounds or cold spots or anything else a person living alone in that house for 3 weeks straight might reasonably want to know about beforehand. Pruitt's voice tightened noticeably at that question, and he told me, with less patience than he had shown at any earlier point in our conversation, that old houses simply had reputations in small towns. He added that I should not let local gossip interfere with completing the work I had been contracted and generously paid to finish on schedule. I hung up feeling more frustrated than reassured, and I spent the rest of that Friday finishing the second bedroom despite the rocking chair sitting motionless now in the corner where I had left it, refusing to look at it directly more than I absolutely had to while I worked around it. By Saturday I had made a decision I knew Pruitt would not approve of, and one that Rachel would have argued against fiercely if I had told her about it beforehand over the phone that morning. I found an old ring of keys in a kitchen drawer, unlabeled and clearly decades old, tarnished brass keys of varying sizes that Margaret had apparently kept for opening cabinets and outbuildings scattered around the property over the years. One of them, smaller and more ornate than the rest, looked like it might match the old-fashioned lock on the door at the top of the back staircase, and I carried the whole ring upstairs with me that afternoon, my heart pounding harder with every step I climbed toward that landing. The key turned on the second try, the mechanism inside the old lock grinding stiffly before finally giving way with a heavy metallic clunk that seemed to echo down the empty staircase behind me. The door swung inward slowly, hinges protesting with a long, low groan, and the room beyond it hit me first with its smell, a thick mustiness layered over something faintly sweet and unpleasant that made me want to step back rather than forward. It had clearly been a child's sewing room once, judging by the small work table pushed against the far wall and the child-sized rocking horse standing near the window, both coated in a fine gray dust that had settled undisturbed for what looked like years, if not decades, of neglect. But the walls told a different story than the furniture did, covered edge to edge with photographs, newspaper clippings, and pages of handwritten notes pinned up in overlapping layers that Margaret had apparently added to steadily across the better part of her long life in that house. I stepped inside slowly, my flashlight beam moving across the walls, and I realized within moments that I was looking at decades of obsessive documentation, Margaret's own private investigation into whatever had haunted this house, since long before she ever married into the family that owned it. Newspaper clippings about Edwin's disappearance hung beside older clippings about the caretaker found frozen in the orchard. Beside those hung photocopied pages from what looked like a much older diary. The handwriting cramped and slanted in a style I recognized immediately from the excerpt Dale had read aloud to me back at the Athenaeum. There were photographs too, faded instant prints from what must have been the 1970s or 80s, showing empty rooms in the farmhouse with strange, pale smudges caught in the corners of several frames. Margaret had circled those smudges in red pen, with small handwritten notes beside them. I could not fully make out in the dim light. On the small work table sat a leather-bound ledger, thick and heavy, its cover cracked with age, and beside it lay a stack of letters tied together with faded ribbon, addressed in Margaret's own handwriting to someone whose name I did not recognize at first glance. I reached for the ledger and the stack of letters, meaning to carry everything downstairs where the light was better and the air did not sit quite so thick and cold against my skin. The door behind me swung shut on its own then, with enough force to rattle the small work table and send a puff of gray dust rising into the flashlight beam. I crossed the room quickly and tried the handle, and it would not turn at all. The old mechanism suddenly rigid in a way it had not been only minutes earlier, when I first let myself inside without any trouble whatsoever. I threw my shoulder against the door twice, hard enough that my arm ached afterward, and on the third attempt the handle finally gave way and the door swung open into the empty hallway beyond, the sudden give sending me stumbling forward onto my knees on the bare wooden floor. I stayed down there a moment, breathing hard, telling myself the old block had simply stuck the way old blocks sometimes do, though some colder part of me understood, even then, that I had just been shown, deliberately and specifically, that leaving that room was not always going to be my decision to make. I carried the ledger and the letters downstairs to the kitchen table rather than reading them in that cold, unsettling room, and I spent the rest of that Saturday evening working through them by lamplight with a cup of tea going cold beside me, forgotten. The ledger, it turned out, had belonged to Josiah Weathersby himself, a record he began keeping in 1849 following the sitting that convinced him he had truly reached his daughter Abigail on the other side of whatever divided the living from the dead. The early entries were full of hope, describing his joy at hearing her voice again, at feeling her presence move through the rooms she had loved as a small girl. The tone shifted noticeably by the entries dated into the following year, growing anxious and then outright fearful, as Josiah began to realize that whatever he had invited into his home was not entirely his daughter anymore, but something that had learned to wear her voice the way a person might wear a borrowed coat. One entry, dated the 3rd of March in 1850, described the presence growing agitated whenever the house sat too quiet or too empty for too long. Josiah wrote of losing 2 servants that same winter to sudden, unexplained illness, after both had attempted, against his own wishes, to leave the property and seek work elsewhere in the county. He wrote that he had come to understand, through what he called communications received during increasingly desperate late-night sittings, that the thing residing in his house required a constant tether, a living person present within its walls at nearly all times. Its hunger, his word, not mine, grew sharper and more dangerous whenever that tether went unattended for too many consecutive days in a row, he wrote. Josiah described making what he called an arrangement, though the entries grew frustratingly vague on the specifics, mentioning only a binding, a promise made in blood and in writing. It would keep the thing satisfied so long as someone always remained in residence, tending the house and, in some way the diary never fully explained, feeding whatever appetite the presence carried with it. The letters told a more personal version of the same story, written across several decades in Margaret's own hand and addressed. I realized after reading the first 2, not to any living recipient at all. She had continued writing to her vanished husband, it seemed, for years after the county declared him legally dead and gone. In the earliest letters, dated not long after their wedding in 1953, Margaret described Edwin's mother pulling her aside privately to explain what marrying into the Weathersby family actually required of her. It was a duty passed down quietly through the generations, one no outsider could ever have guessed at from the outside looking in. The house needed a keeper, always, someone bound to it by blood or by marriage or, in the absence of either, by contract, and the role had fallen to different family members across the decades depending on who remained willing and available to carry it. Margaret wrote that she had not fully believed it at first, dismissing it as an old family superstition the way any sensible young bride might, until she experienced the house for herself during her very first winter living there as Edwin's new wife. By the time Edwin finally vanished in 1971, Margaret had already spent nearly 2 full decades tending faithfully to that property alone. According to one particularly difficult letter dated that same October, she believed her husband's disappearance was not an accident at all, but a kind of payment the house had extracted directly, a hunger grown too large for one keeper alone to keep satisfying indefinitely. She wrote that she had considered leaving many times in the years that followed, packing bags on at least 3 separate occasions that she described in painful detail. Each time she found herself unable to walk out the front door, gripped by a physical dread so overwhelming it left her shaking and unable to breathe, until she finally turned back and unpacked everything again. Her final letters, dated within the last 5 years of her life, grew increasingly focused on a single worry, repeated across several different pages in slightly different words each time. She was growing too old and too frail to continue serving as keeper much longer, and the house would need someone new before too many more winters passed over it. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after finishing the last letter, the lamp burning low, trying to convince myself that grief and isolation could explain everything I had just read without requiring any of it to be literally true in the way Margaret clearly believed it was. But even as I told myself that story, some colder and more honest part of me was already lining up everything I had personally witnessed since arriving at the house against everything Margaret had described in her own increasingly desperate handwriting. The rocking chair that moved on its own, the footsteps on the stairs, and the child's voice singing behind a locked door that had not been opened, as far as I knew, in longer than I had actually been alive. All of it came rushing back at once. I was still sitting there, turning it over in my mind, when the kitchen light flickered once, then went out entirely, plunging the room into a darkness broken only by the thin beam of my flashlight sitting forgotten on the table beside the ledger. I sat frozen for a moment, waiting for my eyes to adjust, telling myself the ancient wiring in a house that old had probably failed 100 times before without anything sinister behind it. Then I heard it, the same slow, deliberate creak of the back staircase I had heard twice before, except this time the sound was not moving upward toward the locked door at all. It was moving downward, toward the kitchen where I sat with nothing but a flashlight and a table full of documents that suddenly felt like evidence I had stolen from something that wanted it back. I grabbed the flashlight and the ledger both, some instinct telling me not to leave the documents behind no matter what happened next, and I backed toward the front door as the footsteps reached the bottom of the staircase and started down the hallway in my direction, at an unhurried, almost curious pace. The flashlight beam caught something at the end of the hallway for less than a second, a pale shape low to the ground. It resolved, impossibly, into the outline of a small girl standing perfectly still and watching me, with an attention that felt far too old and far too patient for whatever age her small body suggested. I did not scream, though some distant part of my mind registered surprise at that later, only that I turned and ran, fumbling the front door open and stumbling out onto the porch and down the steps into the cold night air, the ledger clutched against my chest like something that might actually protect me. My car sat right where I'd left it earlier in the driveway, and I nearly reached it safely before my foot caught hard on a root or a stone I never even saw in the dark. I went sprawling hard onto the gravel with enough force to knock the wind clean out of my lungs and open a deep scrape along my forearm, the pain not fully registering until much later that same night. I lay there a moment, gasping, and when I finally forced myself to look back toward the house, the porch and the hallway beyond the open front door stood completely empty. No pale shape, no small watching figure, nothing but the ordinary dark bulk of an old farmhouse sitting silent under a sky full of more stars than I had ever once seen back home in Burlington. I got up slowly, my arm throbbing and my hands shaking badly enough that it took 3 separate tries just to get my key into the stubborn car door. I sat behind the wheel a long time without starting the engine, staring at the house and trying to decide whether I had actually seen anything at all, or whether exhaustion and fear had simply shown me what I had spent the evening reading in Margaret's own increasingly unstable handwriting. I did not go back inside that house again that particular night, not for anything, not even the ledger in letters still sitting on the kitchen table where I had left them. I slept, or tried to, in the driver's seat with the doors locked and the ledger on the passenger seat beside me, waking every 20 minutes or so to check the dark windows for any sign of movement. By the time the sky finally began lightening toward dawn, I had made a decision that felt, in that gray, exhausted light, like the only sane choice left available to me. I decided, sitting there stiff and exhausted in the driver's seat with the sun finally coming up over the tree line, that I was not simply going to pack up and vanish back to Burlington without understanding what I was actually dealing with. Not after everything I had already read and seen and felt over the past 10 unsettling days spent alone inside that particular house. If Margaret's ledger and letters were even partially true, walking away without knowing the full shape of the arrangement she had described might mean carrying some version of this danger home with me. Regardless of the distance I put between myself and victory, it would follow me back to a house in Burlington where my own son slept most nights. I drove into Concord that morning instead of back toward the farmhouse, bought coffee and a bandage for my arm at the little pharmacy on the main street, and sat in my car in the parking lot composing, in my head, exactly what I planned to ask Dale Corey the moment the Athenaeum opened its doors for the day. Whatever Josiah Weathersby had actually promised in 1850, and whatever price the house had been quietly collecting ever since, I needed the rest of that story before deciding what to do next. Some stubborn part of me, the same part that had taken this job in the first place out of desperation, refused to leave victory without it. Dale looked older that morning than he had during our first conversation. Or maybe I simply noticed it more clearly after everything I had been through the night before. The scrape on my arm still throbbing faintly beneath the pharmacy bandage as I sat down across from him at his usual table. I told him what I had found in the locked room, the ledger, the letters, the pale figure I had glimpsed in the hallway before I ran, and he listened without interrupting once, his expression growing more grave with every detail I added to the account. When I finally finished telling him everything, Dale sat quiet for a long, uncomfortable moment before speaking again. Then he told me something he said he had never shared with anyone who still lived out at the property, something he had only pieced together after decades of careful research into records most people in Victory preferred to pretend never existed at all. Josiah's arrangement, as best Dale could reconstruct it from scattered documents across 3 separate archives, involved the binding sealed each generation through a written vow. It was signed in the keeper's own hand and sealed with a drop of their own blood pressed into the ledger's pages, promising continuous residence and tending in exchange for the entity leaving the wider household and the surrounding town alone. Dale pulled a photocopy from his own files, a page he had reproduced years earlier from the ledger before Margaret stopped allowing outside researchers any access to it. It listed, in Josiah's original hand and in several different hands added over the generations since, a chain of names running from Josiah himself down through nearly a dozen keepers across 170 years. Some names had a date of death written beside them in the same ink, while others simply trailed off mid-century with no closing notation at all. Dale told me the family had always assumed those unmarked names belonged to keepers who had, in his own words, simply stopped keeping without anyone ever finding out what became of them. He pointed out 2 names in particular from the 1890s, a cousin named Thaddeus Weathersby who took over as keeper after Josiah's own death in 1887, and who appeared in no census record after 1893. A hired housekeeper named Sarah Prue had her employment end, according to a single terse line in the town clerk's ledger, on the 2nd of December in 1899, without any further explanation ever recorded. Edwin's name appeared near the bottom of the list, his death year filled in Margaret's own careful hand sometime after the county's official declaration. Beneath his name, in handwriting older and shakier than anything else on the page, was written the single word Margaret, with no closing date at all, since she had apparently added her own name decades before her actual death that past February. I asked Dale, my voice not quite steady, why he thought Margaret had kept living there for over 50 years after Edwin vanished, rather than simply walking away from the house in the arrangement Josiah had made so long before either of them was ever born into the family. Dale said he had wondered the same thing for years, and that the only answer he had ever found, buried in one of Margaret's own letters to the Historical Society requesting copies of certain census records, was a single line that had stayed with him ever since he first read it. She had written that leaving was not, strictly speaking, a choice available to a keeper once they had lived in the house long enough for the binding to take hold. The house did not so much keep its keepers by force as by a kind of slow persuasion, one that left a person unable to imagine wanting to be anywhere else, until eventually they could no longer leave even when every instinct told them they should. I thanked Dale for his time, gathered up his photocopies along with the ones I had brought from the house myself, and drove back toward Victory with a plan already forming, half-formed and desperate, to leave the property that same afternoon and never look back at it again. The dirt road into the property looked different in the early afternoon light than it had at night. Ordinary and almost peaceful, sunlight breaking through the canopy in patches that made the whole drive feel briefly, deceptively normal as I approached the house one last time. I told myself I only needed 20 minutes, enough time to grab my suitcase, my laptop, and the boxes of photographs I had already taken for the estate records. I would call Pruitt from the road to explain I was terminating the contract early, money or no money, since no amount of it felt worth another night inside that house after what I had seen in the hallway. The house looked unchanged when I pulled into the driveway, the same peeling white paint, the same dark windows reflecting the afternoon sky back at me. For a moment, standing beside my car with the engine still running, I almost convinced myself the entire previous night had been some kind of exhaustion-driven hallucination and nothing more. I went inside quickly, moving with a purpose I had not felt since arriving nearly 2 weeks earlier, and I made it as far as the guest room, my suitcase half packed on the bed. Then I heard the humming start again, closer this time than it had ever been, coming from directly behind me, in a room I had just walked through and knew for certain had been empty only seconds earlier. I turned around slowly, the way you turn around when some deep animal part of your brain already knows exactly what it is going to find and simply needs the rest of you to catch up to that knowledge. She stood in the doorway, small and pale in a dress that looked decades out of fashion. Her face turned slightly downward so that I could not see her eyes clearly in the dim afternoon light filtering through the hallway window behind her. "Abigail," I said, the name coming out of me before I had consciously decided to speak it aloud, and the small figure went very still, as though hearing her own name spoken by a stranger after 170 years had genuinely surprised whatever remained of her inside that house. She did not move closer, not at first, and in the silence that stretched between us I found myself thinking, absurdly, of Sam, of his small face turned up toward mine at bedtime. I wondered whether Josiah's daughter had looked at her own father that same way once, before whatever happened to her in that house changed her into something that could no longer simply rest. "You have to stay," she said, or something like her said it, the voice thin and layered strangely over itself, as though more than one throat were shaping the same simple sentence at the same exact moment. I told her, my voice shaking badly now, that I was not Margaret, that I had never agreed to anything, that I had only come to catalog furniture and photographs before an auction, and nothing more than that. But even as I said it, I felt a cold weight pressing down against my chest that had nothing to do with fear alone. The figure in the doorway tilted her head, an unnervingly adult gesture on such a small frame, and told me, in that same layered voice, that the ledger did not require agreement, only presence, only time spent within these particular walls. I had already given it both freely, without ever meaning to, across the 10 full days I had already spent asleep and awake inside that quiet house. I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper, what would happen if I simply refused, if I got in my car right now and drove away and never once looked back at Victory or this house or anything connected to it for the rest of my natural life. She was quiet for a moment, tilting her head the other way now, and told me that Josiah had asked the same question once, long ago, and that the house had answered him the same way it intended to answer me, patiently, and at a time of its own choosing rather than mine. She said the hunger did not need permission, only proximity, and that a keeper who tried to leave too soon after the binding took hold tended to find the leaving harder with every mile put between themselves and the property. Eventually the pull became a physical thing, a sickness in the chest and the legs that would not ease until they turned around and came back home again. I asked her, my hand shaking now around the ledger I still clutched against my chest. Whether Margaret had ever truly wanted to stay all those years, or whether she too had simply run out of road long before she ever stopped trying to leave. Something that might have been sorrow passed over the small pale face then, gone as quickly as it appeared, and she told me only that wanting had very little to do with any of it anymore. Not for Margaret, and not, she said, looking directly at me for the first time since appearing in that doorway, for me either. I do not remember deciding to run so much as simply finding myself already moving, grabbing my half-packed suitcase off the bed and shoving past the doorway where the small figure had stood only a second before. When I glanced back, the hallway behind me stood completely empty again, as though she had simply stopped existing the moment I stopped looking directly at her. I made it to the kitchen, grabbed my car keys off the counter where I had left them that morning, and pushed through the front door out onto the porch, my suitcase banging awkwardly against the door frame as I hauled it down the steps toward the car still idling in the driveway where I had left it. The drive back down the dirt road felt endless, every shadow between the trees looking for one terrible instant like it might resolve into a small pale shape watching me from among the trunks. Though nothing ever actually did. By the time the pavement finally reappeared beneath my tires, I was gripping the wheel tightly enough that my knuckles had gone white and bloodless. I stopped at Aldersey's on my way out of Victory, some instinct telling me I owed Ruth at least a warning before I disappeared from her small town for good, and she took one look at my face through the glass door before coming around the counter to meet me without waiting for me to say a word first. I told her, quickly and without much coherence, some of what had happened, and she nodded along grimly, unsurprised in a way that told me she had heard some version of this story more than once before, from more than one frightened stranger passing through her store. She pressed my hand between both of hers, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman her age, and told me only to get myself home safely and to stay far away from that road from now on. She added, almost as an afterthought as I turned to leave, that she would keep an eye on the property herself, the way she always tried to whenever a new tenant moved in behind her. I did not stop driving until I reached Concord, where I pulled into the pharmacy parking lot and sat shaking behind the wheel for several long minutes before I trusted myself to call Pruitt with hands that had not fully stopped trembling since I left the house behind me. He answered on the fourth ring, and when I told him I was terminating the contract immediately, that I would not be returning to the property under any circumstances regardless of the financial penalty. His voice on the other end of the line carried a strange, resigned quality that unsettled me almost as much as anything I had witnessed inside the house itself. He told me he understood that this had happened before with previous appraisers the firm had hired over the years, though he had never said as much to me directly before that moment. He asked only that I mail back the keys and the ledger I had apparently removed from the property without authorization, before the estate's attorneys pursued the matter any further. I told him I would think about the ledger, since some stubborn part of me still believed it might matter later, might be evidence of something I would eventually need to explain to someone who could actually help me make sense of everything that had happened over the previous 2 weeks. He also mentioned, before we hung up, that the firm would still send a corrected final invoice reflecting the days actually worked against the original contract. He did not sound especially hopeful, though, that the Ohio cousins overseeing the estate would approve releasing any part of the second-half payment given the circumstances of my departure. I drove straight through to Burlington that same evening, arriving well after dark, and Rachel met me at the door with Sam already asleep upstairs. She took one look at my face and the bandage on my arm before pulling me into a hug that I did not realize, until that exact moment, I had been desperately needing since my very first night alone in that farmhouse. I told her most of it that night, sitting at my own familiar kitchen table again with a cup of tea I actually managed to finish this time around. She did not fully believe every detail, but she believed enough of it to insist I see a doctor about the scrape on my arm, and to insist even more firmly that I never set foot on that property again for any amount of money whatsoever. A certified letter arrived from Pruitt and Combs about 10 days later, formally acknowledging my early termination of the contract and confirming that the partial fee owed had already been wired to my account. It included a brief and oddly stiff paragraph noting that the estate sale had proceeded as originally scheduled, despite my early departure from Victory. I learned from a follow-up email, one Denise sent, apparently without Pruitt's direct approval, that the property itself had not actually sold at auction the way the rest of Margaret's belongings had. It had instead been withdrawn at the last moment and quietly leased to a retired schoolteacher from St. Johnsbury named Carol Whitfield, who asked almost no questions before signing a full year's agreement. Denise mentioned, almost as an aside, that Carol had specifically requested information about visiting the small family cemetery on the property, describing an interest in local history that Denise found charming and I found impossible to read as anything but deeply unsettling given everything I now knew. I did not write back to ask any further questions, telling myself firmly that Carol Whitfield's decisions were her own to make, and that I had already done everything a stranger reasonably could to warn a woman I had never actually met about a house I no longer had any legal claim or connection to whatsoever. 3 weeks passed after that, and life in Burlington slowly resumed something close to its normal shape. Mortgage payments caught up thanks to the partial fee Pruitt's firm still wired me despite my early departure. Sam back in school. The whole ordeal began to feel, in the daylight at least, like something that had happened to a slightly different version of myself, in a slightly different life. I kept the ledger locked in a filing cabinet in my home office, unable to bring myself to mail it back to Pruitt the way he had requested, and unable, if I am honest, to bring myself to open it again either. Though I thought about it more often than I wanted to admit to Rachel whenever she asked how I was doing. I told myself the humming I sometimes thought I heard from Sam's room late at night was nothing more than the house settling. The same explanation I had given myself so many times out at the farmhouse, though I noticed I no longer entirely believed it the way I once had before Victory. It was Sam, in the end, who noticed it first, mentioning one evening at dinner in early May, almost casually, that he had made a new friend who liked to sit in his room sometimes after he had already fallen asleep. A girl, he said, who hummed a song he did not know the words to but had somehow started humming himself over the past several days without quite realizing where he had learned the tune. I set down my fork very slowly, my whole body going cold in a way that had nothing to do with the kitchen temperature, and asked him, as steadily as I could manage, what the girl looked like, though some part of me had already known the answer before he ever opened his mouth to give it. I called Dale Corey again the very next morning, my hands shaking badly the same way they had that first night I fled the farmhouse. I asked him whether the binding, whatever it actually was, could travel with a keeper who had already spent time inside the house, whether presence and time within those walls, as Abigail had told me herself, might already have been enough, regardless of what happened afterward. That same afternoon, after hanging up with Dale, I forced myself to unlock the filing cabinet in my home office and take the ledger out for the first time since carrying it away from the farmhouse. I told myself I needed to check something specific in Josiah's early entries about how long a binding typically took to fully settle over a new keeper. The book fell open on its own, the way a well-worn spine will sometimes do, to a page well past the last entry I remembered reading at that kitchen table in Victory. A page that should have been blank the way every page after Margaret's name had been blank when I last looked through it. It was not blank anymore. Not the way it should have been. Not the way I clearly and specifically remembered it being the very last time I had dared to look inside. Beneath Margaret's name, in handwriting that was unmistakably my own despite my having no memory of ever picking up a pen and writing in that book, was a single line reading simply my name, followed by the date of my very first night inside the farmhouse. The ink sat slightly smudged near the edges of the letters, the way fresh ink always smudges when a hand moves too quickly across a page to let it properly dry first. I closed the ledger and sat with my hands pressed flat against its cracked leather cover for a long time, trying to think of anyone I could show it to who would not simply assume I had written that line myself during some stress-induced episode I had no memory of afterward. It was Rachel, oddly enough, who handed me the next piece of the puzzle without ever realizing it. Not at the time she said it anyway. She mentions, almost in passing over dinner one evening, that a friend of hers from nursing school had just accepted a strange short-term position out in rural New Hampshire, cataloging the belongings of an elderly widower who had died alone in a house his family had occupied for generations. The pay, Rachel said, sounded almost too good to be real. Enough to cover her friend's entire year of tuition for a nursing certification she had been putting off for lack of funds. The woman was required to live on site alone for the full length of the contract with almost no outside contact permitted during that time. I asked Rachel, as evenly as I could manage, who exactly had made the offer, and she said she thought it had come through some small regional law firm though she could not remember the name off the top of her head and promised to ask her friend directly if it actually mattered to me for some reason. I told her it probably did not matter, that I was only curious, though I spent the rest of that night unable to sleep, wondering how many other law firms, in how many other small towns, were quietly circulating the same kind of offer to people whose bank accounts had run thin enough to make refusing it feel impossible. Dale did not have a satisfying answer for me, only the same careful, worried tone he had used the first time we ever spoke, and he told me that in all his years researching the Weathersby family, he had never once heard of anyone successfully outrunning what the house had already taken hold of inside them. I tried burning the ledger myself 2 nights after that call, out in the small fire pit behind my own house, pouring lighter fluid over the cracked leather cover and holding a match to it until my fingers ached from the heat. The pages caught easily enough at first, curling and blackening along the edges the way any ordinary old paper naturally should have caught. The flames died back on their own well before the book was even half consumed, leaving the center pages, including the one bearing my own freshly written name, completely untouched beneath a thin layer of soot I could wipe away with nothing more than my own bare thumb. I sat there in the cold that night, staring at the damaged, stubborn thing in my lap for a long time, understanding, finally, in a way Dale's careful academic explanations had never quite managed to make real for me. Exactly what I was actually dealing with. Not a story anymore, not a superstition, not even simply a haunted house standing empty out in the Northeast Kingdom, but something that had already decided, with or without my permission, how this was going to end. I have not gone back to Victory since that late autumn afternoon, and I have not opened the ledger again, though some nights I lie awake listening for the sound of small footsteps in the hallway outside my own bedroom door, the way I used to listen for them on that back staircase. Some nights, more often now than I would like, I hear something that might be humming, coming from down the hall where my son sleeps with his door left slightly open, the way he has always preferred it since he was small. I do not know yet whether the arrangement Josiah Weathersby made back in 1850 has already claimed a new keeper in me, or whether it has simply followed me quietly home to wait. It waits patiently, the way it apparently waited through generation after generation of the Weathersby family, before it ever reached someone like me, an outsider, a stranger who only came for the money and stayed 3 short weeks before running as far and as fast as I possibly could.